back in studio with us, and this time we are talking about well water. You know, last week we discussed septic compliance.
Yeah.
This time, well water. Why are we talking about this at this time of the year?
It's really a year-round thing.
Okay.
But
I thought maybe it was a springtime deal.
no, it's really subject to any property that you're buying or selling that's not on city services. Could be part of transaction.
Where in the process does this whole thing come to play? Not only septic, but also well water, that kind of thing.
Typically, after it's negotiated in as part of the purchase agreement, and it's typically testing on the water itself happens within the first week to 2 weeks after the purchase agreement has been formalized.
Is this part of the disclosure stuff?
So seller is required to do what's called a well disclosure, meaning there's two folds. There's the mechanicals of a well, and so on a disclosure, they're going to have to draw a map, say the location of the well, where it is, and that's really from the state's perspective. They want to know if there's a well on a property, where it is, the specifics, the depth, the type, all of that.
Okay.
Now, the other facet that commonly gets lumped together, but there are two differentiating factors, is aside from the mechanicals, there's the water quality itself.
Gotcha.
And so when you're drafting a purchase agreement and it's contingent on a well test, what you're really referring to is the water quality, not necessarily the mechanical functionality, the pump and that sort of thing. So it's important that if you want to test and make sure that it's fully operational and works, that's a separate inspection. The well water contingency is the water quality itself.
Exactly. So I'm thinking if I own a well, I hope that I'm well versed enough as to the times appropriateness when I need to be checking that water quality. Heavy rain, flood situation, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, it all matters. There's filtration systems that can be utilized. Basically, it depends on the lender, a buyer's lender, on the level of water testing that they require as well too. There's no governing authority that mandates a water quality test.
Sure.
It's basically for your own personal peace of mind as well as a lender, depending on the type of loan. Some loans won't require it. Other loans, FHA, VA, are going to have more stringent requirements for that water test. So that's done right after the purchase agreement. The things they're testing for are bacteria, which is coliform, nitrates, arsenic, lead, magnesium. Those sorts of things are what they're testing for in the quality of the water.
Okay, and again, this is kind of important because you can test and everything can be perfect, but then if you have a big weather event, like I said, 8 to 10 inches of rainfall or a flood goes on or something like that, that whole thing can go out the window.
Yeah, the state of Minnesota, they recommend different tests, for instance, like coliform and bacteria, to test annually.
Right.
And so that, you're right, it just because it passes at the time of purchase, it can fluctuate and change. The other thing is if a house has been vacant for a number of months or even a year,
right.
That you're more likely to get a failing test as far as bacteria. So there's things that you hear the term shock the well, which is bleaching and running the well. In realtor world, if a house has been vacant, we're doing a water test, we'll go and run a hose and run in that for 2 or 3 hours to flush the system out, because if it gets stagnant, it's going to build up with bacteria and that sort of thing. So there's all sorts of little nuances with that. The other thing, and we're talking about well water as your primary source.
Sure.
In St. Cloud here specifically, you have a large number of homes that have wells in them that the homes are now connected to city services, and the wells are simply for irrigation purposes, right? So typically, people don't test for that. You're not drinking it. That's simply, when you're irrigating, you don't have to pay for city water, which can be costly, right? So that's a huge value. The thing to know when you're buying a home with what I would call an auxiliary well.
Right, or a sand point or something.
Yeah, something that's not for drinking, showering, it's just for outside use, is when you go to close on the home, the seller has to disclose at the state of Minnesota if there's a well on the property, where that is, and there's going to be 3 options, and it's going to be either in use, not in use, or sealed. And so if a seller discloses that it's not in use, a buyer is likely that's going to raise a red flag at the state of Minnesota,
Okay.
and they charge a fee annually for that. So that's a little nuance that most people aren't aware of. You want to either put in use or sealed, even if you're not properly using it or it needs some repair.
Sure.
Anytime when you close and you say a well is not in use, you can expect a letter coming in the next 12 to 18 months where they're going to charge you a couple $100s. So I would try and get that well operational and put in use.
All right.
Or have it sealed.
Okay.
Or have it sealed.
Now, again, we'll close this segment out the same way we did the last time. It just illustrates to me the importance of having a good realtor, a good relationship with a good realtor at Voigt Johnson. How do we do that?
Yeah, and I would just say it's important in central Minnesota, like agents that work in the metro don't do a lot of wells and septic. So
Not well-versed.
in central Minnesota, we handle these regularly. And every location, it's important to work with someone local because there's all sorts of customs. Just the things that you deal with on a local basis are important to understand. And so that's why it's important to have someone in central Minnesota. But feel free to reach out to us at 320-774-2400 or online at VoigtJohnson.com.
Brandon, thank you.
You're welcome.